Hello, my wonderful family, and welcome back. We've all heard stories about people from different worlds colliding, but what happens when that collision is literal? And what if the person you save is the one person you should hate? Get ready for a story about fate, fire, and the secrets that bind us. He was a man who had lost everything to a faceless corporation, living only for his daughter. She was the billionaire who ran that corporation, falling from the sky. When he pulled her from the fire, he had no idea he was saving the woman who had, in a way, destroyed his life. The cold was a living thing in the mountains of northern Idaho. It seeped through the cracks in the window frames of Leo's cabin, a place that had stood against the elements for the better part of a century and was starting to lose the fight. It was a good cold, though. An honest cold. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was, which was more than Leo could say for most of the world. He sat at the small, scarred wooden table, a mug of instant coffee warming his chapped hands. The liquid was more brown than it was coffee, but the heat was real. Outside, the pines stood as silent, snow-dusted sentinels under a sky the color of slate. It was quiet, kind of profound quiet that either soothed the man's soul or drove him mad. For Leo, it did a little of both. His gaze drifted to the photograph on the mantelpiece. It was the only one he kept out. Anna. Her smile was brighter than the weak morning light filtering into the room, a flash of warmth frozen in time. It had been 5 years since the structural collapse at the processing plant. 5 years since a memo about acceptable risk and deferred maintenance had translated into a phone call that had cleaved his life in two. He'd sued, of course. He'd fought. But a man with a public defender and a mountain of grief was no match for a corporate legal team. They had sent him a check with a number that was supposed to represent a life and a non-disclosure agreement that was meant to purchase his silence. He'd torn up the check. The silence, however, had settled in all on its own. Daddy? Leo's head snapped up. His daughter, Maya, stood in the doorway of her small bedroom, rubbing the sleep from her 8-year-old eyes. She was a miniature of her mother, all wide, curious eyes, and a spirit that stubbornly refused to be dimmed by their circumstances. She wore a thick woolen sweater that had been his, the sleeves rolled up a comical number of times. "Hey, sleepyhead," he said, his voice a low rumble that always seemed to soften for her. "Bad dream?" She shook her head, her dark curls bouncing. "No, I heard a noise. A loud hum." Leo listened. There was nothing but the sighing of the wind in the trees. Just the wind, sweet pea. "It's an old cabin. It groans a lot, just like your old man." He winked, and she giggled, the sound a small bell in the oppressive quiet. "Can I have oatmeal? With the brown sugar?" she asked, padding over to him and wrapping her arms around his waist. "The good stuff, eh? Special occasion?" he asked, hugging her tightly. The worn fabric of her pajamas was soft against his forearms. This was his world. This tiny, fierce, loving girl. She was the reason he got up, the reason he chopped wood until his hands bled, the reason he took on any odd job the nearby town of Garnet Creek could offer. He was a carpenter, a mechanic, a handyman. He was whatever he needed to be to keep her warm and fed. "It's Thursday," she said, as if that explained everything. He chuckled, a dry, rusty sound. "Well, in that case, oatmeal with the good brown sugar it is." He was a man living in the past, his heart a locked room with Anna's picture on the door. But his hands, his life, his future, they all belonged to the small girl now looking up at him with absolute trust. He was a single dad. He was struggling, and he was, in this small, forgotten corner of the world, getting by. That was enough. It had to be. As he reached for the canister of oats, Maya's words echoed in his mind. A loud hum. He glanced out the window again, a prickle of unease on his neck. The sky was still, heavy, and empty. It was just the wind. Hundreds of miles away and 30,000 feet closer to the sun, the hum was not just a noise. It was the entire world. It was the sound of power, of progress, of untouchable altitude. Inside the cabin of the Gulfstream 650, Isabel Vance didn't even hear it anymore. It was the background music to her life, as constant and as ignored as her own heartbeat. She sat at a polished mahogany table, the leather of her seat cool and unyielding against her back. Her suit was a blade of dark gray silk, her posture impeccable. Across from her, two vice presidents, in identical dark suits, watched her with the nervous attention of courtiers before a queen. On the table between them lay a single sheet of paper. A multi-billion-dollar acquisition deal finalized. The board of K-Tech will fold by morning, she said, her voice calm and level, betraying none of the brutal, sleepless, 72-hour campaign she had just waged to make this happen. Their shareholders will be notified at the bell. Our press release goes out at 9:01 a.m. Eastern. Not a second before. Yes, Mrs. Vance. Understood, Miss Vance. She gave a curt nod, the only acknowledgement she ever offered for a job well done. Praise made people soft. Satisfaction was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her father had built Vance Industries into a titan. He had done it with ruthless efficiency and an almost religious belief that sentiment was a fatal flaw in business. When he had died 2 years ago, leaving the empire in her 32-year-old hands, the world had watched, expecting her to fail. She hadn't. She had become even more formidable, more relentless than he had ever been. She had to. She stared out the small, ovular window at the endless expanse of clouds below, a pristine white sea that looked solid enough to walk on. It was beautiful, sterile, and utterly lonely. Down there, millions of people were living their messy, complicated lives. Up here, there was only the hum, the mission, and the crushing weight of her own name. One of the VPs cleared his throat. Your father would have been incredibly proud, Miss Vance. Isabel's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. She hated when they mentioned her father. They used his memory as a tool, trying to find a crack in her armor, a hint of the daughter instead of the CEO. My father would have been focused on the next quarter, she replied coolly, her gaze still fixed on the clouds. As should you be. The silence that followed was heavy and awkward. She preferred it that way. The jet gave a sudden, slight lurch, a hiccup in the seamless glide through the stratosphere. Isabel's stomach dipped. Turbulence. Normal. She took a sip of water, her hand perfectly steady. Control was everything. Show no weakness. Never let them see you sweat. Her father's words, her personal gospel. Then it happened again. A more violent shudder this time, a sickening drop that sent a pen skittering across the table. One of the VPs gripped his armrests, his knuckles white. Just a bit of weather, the other said, though his voice was a shade too high. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, tight with a professionalism that couldn't quite mask the underlying strain. Ladies and gentlemen, we seem to be experiencing some unexpected engine trouble. We're attempting to assess the situation. Please remain in your seats. Assess the situation. Corporate jargon was so familiar, yet in this context, it was terrifying. Isabel felt the first cold tendril of genuine fear curl in her stomach. The constant, reassuring hum of the engines was changing. It was sputtering, groaning, like a great beast in its death throes. Another violent lurch, and the lights flickered and died, plunging the cabin into a dim, emergency-lit twilight. A series of alarms began to blare, a shrill, panicked chorus. Outside the window, the pristine sea of clouds was gone. All she could see was the ground, a terrifying patchwork of dark green and white, rushing up at them at an impossible speed. The two VPs were muttering prayers, their faces masks of pure terror. All the pretense, all the power suits and corporate speak. They were just scared men, about to die. And Isabel? Isabel Vance, the woman who controlled a global empire, who could buy and sell companies with the stroke of a pen, who had never lost a negotiation in her life, was utterly, completely powerless. As the jet screamed towards the earth, her last coherent thought was not of balance sheets or stock prices. It was a sudden, piercing awareness of the profound, crushing emptiness of her life. Then, impact. It's incredible how a single moment can shatter two completely different worlds. One person is defined by what they've lost, the other by what they've gained, yet both find themselves at the mercy of forces beyond their control. Have you ever had a moment where your entire world was turned upside down, forcing you to see everything differently? What did that moment teach you about yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The sound was what hit him first. Not a hum, but a violent, guttural scream of metal tearing through the sky, a sound that violated the sacred quiet of his mountain. It was followed by a cataclysmic boom that shook the very foundations of the old cabin. The windows rattled in their frames, and the canister of oats slipped from Leo's hand, dusting the worn floorboards with a pale powder. Maya cried out, a sharp yelp of fear, and clung to his leg. "Daddy, what was that?" Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. He'd heard logging accidents, the distant thud of dynamite from the quarry miles away, but this was different. This was apocalyptic. He scooped Maya into his arms, his mind racing. His eyes darted to the window, and he saw a pillar of greasy black smoke rising from beyond the ridge, a profane smudge against the gray sky. It was close. Too close. Every instinct screamed at him to lock the door, to keep his daughter safe, to hunker down and let the world handle its own disasters. He had done his part. He had tried to fight the world once, and it had crushed him. Now, his world was just the two of them, and his only job was to protect it. But then he saw the flicker of orange at the base of the smoke. Fire. He thought of Anna. He thought of twisted metal and indifferent reports. He thought of a human being trapped in a place they shouldn't be. Cursing under his breath, he made a decision. He could not go. It wasn't in him. "Maya, sweet pea, listen to me," he said, setting her down and looking her straight in the eye. He held her small shoulders, his grip firm and reassuring. "I need you to be a very brave girl for me. I need you to stay inside. Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone. You understand? Anyone." Her lower lip trembled, but she nodded, her eyes wide with a fear that tore at his soul. "Are you coming back?" He pulled her into a fierce, desperate hug, burying his face in her hair. "Always," he whispered. "I will always come back to you." He grabbed his heaviest coat, a worn-out axe, and a first aid kit that was mostly just bandages and antiseptic wipes. As he stepped out into the biting cold, he heard the click of the bolt behind him. The sound both fortified and terrified him. The journey to the crash site was a battle. The snow was deeper than it looked, hiding treacherous roots and rocks beneath its placid surface. The air grew thick with the acrid stench of jet fuel and burning plastic, a chemical cocktail that made his eyes water and his stomach churn. The roar of the fire grew louder with every step, a hungry, living thing. After 10 minutes of grueling trekking, he broke through a line of pines and stopped dead. It was a scene from hell. A private jet, or what was left of it, was torn in half, its fuselage crumpled like a discarded soda can. The tail section was lodged high in the snow-laden branches of an ancient fir tree, while the cockpit was buried nose first in a deep ravine. The main section of the cabin was a vortex of flame. He scanned the wreckage, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. He saw two figures, thrown clear from the impact, lying motionless in the snow. Their bodies were bent at unnatural angles. He knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that there was nothing he could do for them. He was too late. He was about to turn back, the metallic taste of failure and bile in his mouth, when he heard it. A faint moan. It came from the main section, near the flames. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through his despair. He scrambled closer, the heat washing over his face. The fuselage was a mangled ruin, but one of the emergency doors had been torn from its hinges, creating a gaping hole. And just inside, half pinned beneath a piece of twisted metal, was a woman. Her face was smudged with soot and blood, but it was her hair that he noticed first, a cascade of dark blonde silk, stark against the grime. She was wearing a gray suit that looked impossibly, ridiculously out of place in this wilderness. One of her arms was trapped, but she was stirring, fighting, alive. "Hey!" he yelled, his voice raw. "Can you hear me?" Her head lolled in his direction. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, dazed. "Help! Me!" The fire was spreading, licking greedily at the spilled fuel, seeping into the snow. He had minutes, maybe seconds. Adrenaline surged through him, a white-hot current that banished all fear, all hesitation. He was no longer a grieving husband or a struggling father. He was a man with a single purpose, to pull this woman from the fire. He used the axe to lever the heavy piece of wreckage pinning her arm. The metal groaned in protest. "Almost there," he grunted, putting his entire body into it. "Just hold on." The metal shifted just enough. She cried out in pain as she pulled her arm free. It was bleeding, clearly broken, but it was free. "You have to move," he shouted over the roar of the flames. "We have to go now." She tried to stand, but her legs buckled. She was in shock, her body a dead weight. Without another thought, Leo lunged into the opening, grabbed her under the arms, and pulled. He dragged her through the snow, away from the inferno, his boots slipping, his lungs burning. He didn't stop until they were 100 feet away, collapsing behind the relative safety of a thicket of trees. Just as he did, the plane's fuel tank ignited. A deafening explosion sent a fireball into the sky, and a wave of heat washed over them. Leo shielded her body with his own, the world reduced to a maelstrom of light and sound. In the ringing silence that followed, he rolled off her, panting. He looked down at the woman he had just saved. Her eyes were closed now, her breathing shallow. He gently brushed a soot-stained strand of hair from her cheek. Her skin was cold, too cold. He had saved her from the fire. Now, he had to save her from the cold. Lifting her was a monumental effort. She was taller than he'd realized, all long limbs and dead weight. He draped her over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, the pain in his back and legs immediate and sharp. But he pushed it down. He thought of Maya, waiting behind a locked door. He thought of the promise he had made. The journey back was a blur of agony. Every step was a negotiation with gravity, with exhaustion, with the creeping cold. When he finally stumbled onto his own porch, He was running on fumes. He banged on the door with his free hand. "Maya, it's Daddy. Open the door." The bolt slid back instantly, and the door flew open. Maya stood there, her face pale. Her eyes went from his face to the unconscious woman slung over his shoulder, and then back to him. There was no fear in her eyes now, only a quiet, solemn understanding. "Is she hurt?" Maya asked, her small voice cutting through his exhaustion. "Yeah, sweet pea," Leo gasped, staggering inside and gently lowering the woman onto the worn rug in front of the fireplace. "She's hurt, bad." He didn't know who she was. He didn't know where she'd come from. All he knew was that for the first time in 5 years, he had brought someone back from the brink instead of just watching them go. And as he knelt beside her, checking her pulse, he felt something stir within him, a feeling so foreign he could barely name it. It was a flicker of purpose that had nothing to do with grief. Isabel woke to 2 sensations, a dull, throbbing pain that seemed to radiate from every cell in her body, and the smell of wood smoke. For a long, disorienting moment, she thought she was dead. Then the pain sharpened, focusing in her arm and ribs, and she knew with grim certainty that she was alive. She forced her eyes open. The world swam into a blurry focus of rough-hewn wooden beams and a flickering orange light. A fireplace. She was lying on a soft, lumpy surface, a couch, she realized, covered by a heavy, scratchy wool blanket. Her expensive silk suit was gone, replaced by what felt like a man's oversized flannel shirt. The violation of it, the intimacy, sent a jolt of alarm through her. She tried to sit up, but a searing pain in her arm shot her back down with a gasp. Her left forearm was splinted with 2 rough pieces of wood and wrapped in clean white strips of cloth. Professionally done. Or, at least, competently. Easy there. You've got a broken arm, and probably a few cracked ribs. The voice was low and steady, coming from the shadows in the corner of the room. A man emerged into the firelight. He was tall and lean, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same rugged landscape as the cabin. There were lines of exhaustion around his eyes, and a dark stubble covered a strong jaw. He held a mug in his hands and regarded her with an expression that wasn't unkind, but was utterly devoid of awe or deference. It was a look she hadn't encountered in a very long time. Her corporate instincts, honed over a decade of hostile takeovers and boardroom battles, kicked in. Assess. Control. Command. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice raspier than she intended. "Where am I?" "I need a phone. A satellite phone. My team needs to be contacted immediately." The man took a slow sip from his mug before answering. "Name's Leo. This is my cabin, and you're not contacting anyone?" The storm knocked out the tower, and even if it hadn't, my cell phone gave up the ghost about 3 years ago. Isabel stared at him, dumbfounded. Casual dismissal of her authority was as foreign as the rustic surroundings. "There was a crash," she said, more to herself than to him, the fragmented memories returning in terrifying flashes. The screaming alarms. The ground rushing up to meet them. The pilots. My colleagues. Leo's face softened for a fraction of a second, a flicker of empathy in his gray eyes. "I'm sorry. You were the only one I found alive." The words hit her with the force of a physical blow. Richard, Mark, dead. The reality of it was cold and absolute. She had sent them to their deaths. She, who was responsible for everything. A wave of nausea washed over her, but she pushed it down. Grief was a weakness. Vulnerability was a liability. She had a situation to manage. "Right," she said, her voice brittle. Look, Leo, I appreciate what you did. You saved my life, and you will be rewarded. Handsomely. I am Isabel Vance. She said her name as if it were a key, a thing that unlocked doors and solved problems. She expected it to register, to elicit a change in his demeanor, a flicker of recognition, greed even. Nothing. He just looked at her, his expression unchanged. Okay, Isabel Vance. Glad you're awake. The lack of reaction was more unsettling than any argument. Vance Industries, she clarified, growing frustrated. I'm the CEO. My company is worth over $100 billion. I can give you anything you want. A new truck? A new house? Name it. A muscle twitched in his jaw. The flat, neutral expression hardened into something cold and sharp. He set his mug down on the mantelpiece with a definitive thud. I don't want your money, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. I pulled you out of that wreckage because you were a person about to burn to death. That's it. It's not a transaction. His resistance was a brick wall. She wasn't used to people she couldn't buy, couldn't intimidate, couldn't control. His rejection of her offer felt like a personal insult, an invalidation of the very currency her entire world ran on. Everyone wants something, she shot back, a defensive edge to her tone. Maybe, he conceded, his eyes locking onto hers. But not everything has a price tag. A small voice piped up from the doorway. Is the sleeping lady awake? Isabel's head turned. A little girl with dark, curly hair and wide, solemn eyes stood there, clutching a well-loved stuffed bear. She looked from Isabel to Leo, her gaze full of a child's unfiltered curiosity. Leo's entire demeanor shifted instantly. The hard edges softened, the tension in his shoulders eased. He walked over and knelt, bringing himself down to the girl's level. She's awake, sweet pea, he said gently. This is Isabel. She was in an accident. The girl, Maya, took a hesitant step into the room. She looked at Isabel on the couch, not with pity, but with a kind of serious concern. Does it hurt? She asked. The simple question disarmed Isabel completely. It was direct, human, and devoid of any agenda. Yes, she admitted, the answer slipping out before her defenses could catch it. It does. Maya nodded gravely, then turned to her father. Can we give her some soup? The one Mom used to make when I was sick? The mention of Mom hung in the air. Leo's face clouded over for a moment, a flash of deep, ancient pain. That's a good idea, Maya, he said, his voice thick. Go get the bowl. The blue one. As the girl scurried off to the small kitchen area, a tense silence fell between the two adults. Isabel watched him, a dawning realization clicking into place. The worn-out cabin, the single father, the ghost of a mother. He wasn't just poor, he was a man hollowed out by loss. And she, with her talk of money and power, had been impossibly, obscenely crass. She had tried to put a price on an act of human decency, and in doing so, had revealed the cavernous gap between their worlds. He resisted her, not because he was stubborn, but because he operated on a moral code she had long forgotten existed. And she, in turn, resisted him, because his simple, principled existence was a quiet indictment of her own. The storm arrived just after nightfall. It didn't creep in. It descended like a hammer, a blizzard that erased the world outside the cabin's small windows. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, driving snow against the glass with a sound like handfuls of sand. Any hope Isabel had of a swift rescue, of a search party finding the wreckage, was buried under a thick blanket of white. She was trapped. trapped with him. The forced proximity was an awkward, delicate dance. Cabin, which had seemed rustic and cozy when she was unconscious, now felt claustrophobically small. There was one large room, with a curtained-off alcove for Maya's bed and a loft for Leo's. Every movement, every sigh, every rustle of clothing was audible. There was no privacy, no escape. Leo moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency, his focus entirely on the necessities of survival. He stoked the fire, checked the seals on the windows, and prepared the soup Maya had requested. It was a simple chicken broth with vegetables, but the aroma filled the small space with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fireplace. He brought a bowl to her, his movements careful. "You need to eat," he said. It wasn't a request. Isabel's pride bristled. She wasn't used to being cared for, to being told what to do. But her body betrayed her. A wave of dizziness reminded her she hadn't eaten in nearly a day. Her right hand, her good hand, was trembling slightly. "I can't." "My arm," she started, gesturing vaguely at her splinted limb. Without a word, Leo sat on the stone hearth near the couch, took the bowl, and held a spoonful of broth to her lips. The gesture was so shockingly intimate, so devoid of ceremony, that she froze. It was the kind of gentle, practical care one gives to a child or a lover. Coming from this gruff, resentful stranger, it was deeply unsettling. She hesitated, then reluctantly opened her mouth. The soup was hot and savory, a balm to her raw throat. He fed her in silence, his gaze fixed on the task, his expression unreadable. Isabel found herself studying his face in the firelight. The harsh lines seemed softer now. She saw the calluses on his hands, the faint scar above his eyebrow, the way a muscle in his cheek jumped when the wind battered the cabin. These were details of a life lived, a life of physical effort and hardship she couldn't begin to imagine. Maya, finished with her own dinner, came and sat on the floor by the couch, setting up a small family of pine cone figures. She glanced up at Isabel. "My daddy's a good cook," she stated, as if daring Isabel to disagree. "Yes, he is," Isabel found herself replying, the words genuine. "He can fix anything, too," Maya continued, a proud little ambassador for her father. "He fixed Mrs. Henderson's roof and the engine on Mr. Gable's tractor. And he built my bed." She pointed a small finger toward the curtained alcove. Leo stopped, a spoonful of soup halfway to Isabel's mouth. "Maya, that's enough," he said, a note of warning in his voice. He didn't want his life, his struggles, laid bare for this woman's inspection. But Maya was undeterred. "He's sad sometimes, though," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He misses my mommy." The silence that followed was immense. It filled every corner of the cabin, heavier than the storm raging outside. Leo slowly lowered the spoon, his face a mask of stone. He stood up and walked to the window, turning his back on them both. Isabel's heart ached with a sudden, sharp pang of something she couldn't name. It was more than pity. It was a flicker of connection, of shared humanity. Loss was a language she understood, even if her own losses were of a different, more abstract kind. She had lost her father, yes, but she'd never had the kind of love that this man so clearly mourned. She looked at the back of his head, at the rigid set of his shoulders. She wanted to say something, to offer a word of comfort, but what could she possibly say? "I'm sorry for your loss," sounded like a hollow platitude coming from a woman who, hours earlier, had tried to buy his heroism. So she said nothing. Later, after Maya was tucked into bed, the cabin grew quiet again. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the shrieking wind. Leo sat at the wooden table, sharpening the blade of his axe with a whetstone, the rhythmic shiek, 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 a meditative, almost mournful sound. Isabel watched him, the effects of the painkillers he'd given her making the room feel soft and dreamlike. "Your daughter," she began, her voice quiet. She's a wonderful girl." Leo didn't look up from his work. "I know. You're a good father." He stopped, placing the whetstone down. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face in the dim light, as if trying to understand her motive. "Just trying to do right by her," he said, his voice flat. "She said you built her bed." Isabel pressed gently, trying to keep the fragile thread of conversation from snapping. He nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Used the wood from an old pine that fell in a storm a few years back. Anna, my wife, she loved that tree. Seemed right. He had shared something. A small, personal piece of his past. It was an opening, a tiny crack in the wall between them. The storm had forced them into this space, but it was Maya's innocence and the ghost of a woman named Anna that were slowly, reluctantly, forcing them to see the person on the other side. They were no longer just caricatures, the billionaire and the hermit. They were Isabel and Leo. And in the heart of the blizzard, surrounded by the ghosts of their pasts that felt like a monumental shift. It's fascinating how being physically trapped can sometimes be the only thing that sets us emotionally free. When all the noise of the outside world is silenced, we're left with only the truth of who we are. Think about a time you were stuck with someone you thought you had nothing in common with. Did you discover an unexpected connection? Let us know in the comments how that experience changed your perspective. The second day dawned with the storm unabated. The world outside was a churning vortex of white, sealing the cabin in an enforced, almost sacred isolation. Leo had gone out at first light to clear a path to the woodshed and check the integrity of the roof, leaving Isabel alone with the crackling fire and her own swirling thoughts. Pain had become her new companion, a dull, constant ache that kept her grounded in the humbling reality of her situation. She was no longer Isabel Vance, CEO. She was a patient, a survivor, a guest. Her world of schedules, stock tickers, and hostile negotiations had shrunk to the four walls of this cabin. Restless, she swung her legs off the couch. Her body protested, but the need to move, to do something, was overwhelming. She walked slowly around the room, her good hand trailing along the rough-hewn walls. She studied the few items that constituted this man's life, a shelf of worn paperbacks, their spines cracked, a collection of fishing lures, and the single, solitary photograph on the mantel. Anna. Isabel found her gaze drawn to the woman's smiling face. There was a genuine smile, open and full of a light that seemed impossibly bright. What was she like? Isabel wondered. Her exploration led her to a small, unassuming wooden chest tucked under the window seat. It wasn't locked. Driven by a curiosity, she couldn't quite define a need to understand the man who had saved her. To piece together the life behind his guarded eyes, she lifted the lid. The chest was filled with papers. Not clutter, but organized files held together with binder clips. The top file was labeled GARNETCREELAMENAIAMEYA. Inside were drawings made with crayon, a report card with glowing remarks, a permission slip. Isabel smiled faintly. Even in this, he was meticulous. Beneath it was another file, thicker and heavier. The label was stark, A&A. Isabel's breath caught. This felt like a trespass, a violation of something sacred. She should close the lid. She should walk away, but she couldn't. Her fingers, acting of their own accord, lifted the file. Inside were not love letters or photographs, but legal documents. Reams of them. Depositions, expert testimonies, motions to dismiss. And newspaper clippings, yellowed and fragile. The headline of the top clipping jumped out at her. L-O-C-A-R-T-H-S-T-A-R-P-S-A-A-L-M-T-I-L-H-D-S-E-O-M-I-L-I-I-O. Isabel's blood ran cold. She sank onto the window seat, her legs suddenly unable to support her. She read the article, her eyes scanning the text with a terrifying mounting dread. Anna Sheridan, 30 years old, wife of Leo Sheridan, mother of a 3-year-old girl, Maya, killed when a catwalk gave way at the North Star manufacturing facility. The article detailed the lawsuit, Leo's fight against a corporate giant, his claims of cut corners and ignored safety warnings. North Star Manufacturing. The name was vaguely familiar. It wasn't one of their major holdings, but it rang a distant bell from a thick acquisition file. She kept reading, her heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She sifted through the legal papers, her eyes catching on the letterhead of the defendant's counsel. The logo was a stylized mountain range over the words Omnicore Legal Division. Omnicore. The world tilted on its axis. The air in her lungs turned to ice. Vance Industries had acquired Omnicore 3 years ago. It had been a massive, hostile takeover, one of her first major victories as CEO. She remembered the deal. She had personally signed the final papers. The acquisition included all of Omnicore's assets, its holdings, its subsidiaries, and its liabilities. Buried deep within thousands of pages of due diligence, a settled lawsuit over a minor plant collapse in Idaho would have been a footnote, a settled matter, a ghost in the machine. But here, in this cabin, that ghost had a face. That ghost was the smiling woman on the mantelpiece. The man who had pulled her from the fire, who had splinted her arm and fed her soup. He was the man whose life her company had shattered. The faceless corporation that had crushed him, that had offered him blood money for his silence, was her. She was Vance Industries. Its past was her past. Its sins were her sins. She looked at her hands, then at the photograph of Anna. The irony was a physical sickness, a crushing weight on her chest. He had saved the one person in the world who represented everything he had lost. Pain in her arm, in her ribs, was nothing compared to the agony of this revelation. The secret was no longer just his tragic past. It was a shared history, a gaping wound between them that he didn't even know existed. And she, the woman he had just rescued, was the one holding the salt. The front door opened, letting in a swirl of snow and the sharp scent of pine. Leo stomped the snow from his boots, his face flushed from the cold. He looked up and saw her. He saw her sitting by the chest, the file in her lap, her face ashen, her eyes wide with a horror that was too profound to be faked. He followed her gaze to the papers in her hand, and his entire body went rigid. The warmth from the cold vanished, replaced by an icy fury. His face, which had shown flickers of softness and humanity, became a granite mask. "Get out of my things," he said. The words were not shouted. They were spoken in a low, deadly tone that was far more terrifying. Isabel flinched, as if he'd struck her. She slowly placed the file back in the chest, her movements stiff. "Leo," she began, her voice a broken whisper. "I said, get out of my things," he repeated, taking a step toward her. "What gives you the right? You come into my home, and you start digging through my life. through her life. His pain was a palpable force in the room, radiating from him in waves of anger. He wasn't just angry about the privacy violation. He was angry that this woman of privilege, this tourist in his tragedy, had dared to touch the most sacred wound he had. Tears welled in Isabel's eyes, but she did not let them fall. She owed him more than tears. She owed him the truth. She stood, her body trembling, and faced him. "I didn't know," she said, her voice raw with a desperate sincerity. "Leo, I swear to you, when you told me your wife, I had no idea. The name of the company, North Star. What about it?" He snarled. "You going to tell me you've heard of it? Going to offer your condolences?" "We own it," she said, the words falling like stones into the silence. "Vance Industries. We bought the parent company, Omnicore, 3 years ago. I didn't know. It was just a name in a file, a settled liability. I never saw her name. I never knew." Leo stared at her, his mind struggling to process the information. The rage on his face slowly dissolved, replaced by a stunned, hollow disbelief. The corporate monster that had destroyed his family, the faceless entity he had raged against for 5 years, was standing in his living room, wearing his flannel shirt, her arm in a splint he had made. The sheer, cosmic cruelty of it was breathtaking. He staggered back and sank into the chair at the table, running a hand over his face. He looked utterly defeated. "So it was you," he whispered, the fight gone from his voice, leaving only a vast, empty sorrow. "All along. It was you." Isabel took a hesitant step closer. "Doesn't matter that I didn't know," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "The name on the building now is mine. The responsibility is mine." This was not the reaction he expected. He had braced himself for denials, for legal jargon, for a quick offer of a check to make it all go away. He had not expected this. This raw, unvarnished acceptance of guilt. It disarmed him, cracking the armor of his long-held fury. He looked up at her, really looked at her, and saw past the billionaire. He saw a woman, stripped of her power, haunted by a truth she had just discovered. He saw the same shock and horror in her eyes that he had felt for years. The dam of his grief, so carefully constructed for 5 years, finally broke. "Her name was Anna," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. She loved yellow roses. She planted a garden every spring, even though the soil up here is terrible. She used to sing off-key when she cooked. Her laugh, it was the best sound in the world. He talked, and for the first time in years, he didn't just talk about her death, he talked about her life. He resurrected her in the small, warm cabin, filling the space with memories of her. And Isabel listened. She sank to the floor, leaning against the couch, and simply listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't offer platitudes. She just bore witness to his grief, her own guilt, a silent, heavy presence beside her. When his stories trailed off into a heavy silence, she finally spoke, her voice soft. "My father," she said, staring into the fire. "He built the company. He was brilliant and ruthless. He taught me that business was war and sentiment was a weakness. I spent my whole life trying to earn his approval. When he died, he didn't leave me a letter. He left me a controlling share of stock." She looked at Leo, her eyes shining with a different kind of grief, the grief of loneliness, of a life so focused on acquisition that it had forgotten how to connect. "You had a love that people write stories about. I have a portfolio." In that moment, they were not a CEO and a victim. They were 2 people brought together by a violent tragedy now bonded by a shared, impossible past. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin, a fragile peace had settled. Leo reached out, his calloused hand covering her good one where it rested on the couch. It wasn't a gesture of romance, but of solidarity. A silent acknowledgement that they were in this awful, tangled mess together. It felt like, for the first time, healing might just be possible. On the morning of the third day, the storm broke. The wind died down, and a weak, watery sunlight filtered through the clouds, making the fresh snow glitter with a pristine, painful beauty. The silence that followed the blizzard was even more profound. And then they heard it. A faint, rhythmic whump, whump in the distance, growing steadily louder. A helicopter. Isabel's head shot up, a complex mix of relief and dread on her face. Rescue. The outside world was coming to reclaim her. Leo stood and walked to the window. A sleek, black helicopter was circling, scanning the area before finding a place to land in a clearing a few hundred yards from the cabin. "They found you," he said, his voice flat. Before Isabel could respond, the cabin door was flung open. Two men in black tactical gear and heavy winter coats burst in, their eyes scanning the room with a cold, professional assessment. They were followed by a man in an expensive suit, his face grim. This was Cutler, the head of Isabel's personal security detail. "Miss Vance, are you all right?" Cutler asked, rushing to her side, his gaze flicking dismissively over Leo. A paramedic followed, immediately starting to check Isabel's vitals, speaking in a low, urgent tone. The invasion was sudden and brutal. The quiet intimacy of the cabin was shattered, replaced by the clipped, efficient energy of Isabel's world. Leo felt like an intruder in his own home. "Cutler, this is Leo Sheridan," Isabel said, her voice weak but firm. "He saved my life." Cutler gave Leo a cursory nod, the kind one gives to a bellhop. "We're indebted to you, Mr. Sheridan. Our legal team will be in touch regarding appropriate compensation for your services." The word hung in the air between them. Services. It was a splash of ice water, a deliberate reduction of a heroic, life-altering act into a line item on an expense report. It was exactly the corporate dismissal he had fought and lost against years ago. He saw the world he despised, in all its cold transactional glory, standing in his living room. "It wasn't a service," Leo said, his voice dangerously low. A third man, a lawyer in a cashmere coat, stepped forward, ignoring him completely. "Ma'am, we have a med-evac chopper waiting to take you to the city. We need to get you to a hospital. We also need to control this narrative before the press gets a hold of it." He glanced around the cabin, a flicker of distaste in his eyes. Isabel tried to push the paramedic away. "Stop! Everyone just stop!" she commanded, but her voice was lost in the organized chaos. She was being absorbed back into her role, the powerful CEO being managed by her handlers. The lawyer then made the final, fatal mistake. He turned to Leo, pulling a business card from his wallet. "Mr. Sheridan, we'd be grateful if you'd sign a non-disclosure agreement. For your discretion. We can be very generous. Generosity. Discretion. Blood, money. The same playbook. The same insult. It was too much. Fragile trust. The bond forged in the crucible of confession and shared grief evaporated in a flash of white-hot rage. Leo looked at Isabel, who was being helped to her feet by Cutler, and in that moment, he didn't see the vulnerable woman who had shared her loneliness. He saw the head of the beast, the queen surrounded by her court, being pulled back into the world that had chewed up his wife and spit out a settlement check. "Get out," he snarled. The lawyer paused, blinking. "I beg your pardon?" I said G-E-T-O-U-T. Leo's voice was a roar that shook the room, a primal scream of every injustice, every ounce of grief he had swallowed for 5 years. He pointed a trembling finger at the door. All of you, get out of my house. His furious gaze landed on Isabel. His eyes were blazing with a pain so deep it looked like hatred. I should have known, he spat, the words laced with the venom of betrayal. This is all you people know how to do. You break things, and you try to pay for the damages. You put a price on everything. On a life. On silence. You even tried to put a price on this. He gestured wildly around the room, at the space that had, for a brief time, felt like a sanctuary. I was a fool to think you were any different. Leo, no, it's not like that. Isabel cried, her voice desperate. She reached a hand toward him, but Cutler firmly pulled her toward the door. Listen to me. But he couldn't hear her. He could only see the ghost of Anna, the yellowed newspaper clippings, the condescending faces of the men who now owned her death. They guided her out of the cabin and toward the waiting helicopter. Just before she was bundled inside, her eyes met Leo's one last time through the open doorway. He saw the desperation and anguish on her face. She saw the absolute, shattering betrayal on his. Then the door was closed, and the helicopter's blades spun faster, whipping snow and debris into the air. Leo stood motionless, watching as it lifted off the ground, carrying away the woman who had crashed into his life and somehow, impossibly, broken his heart all over again. Climbed into the sky and disappeared over the ridge, leaving him alone in the sudden, deafening silence of the mountain. The silence in the cabin was a physical entity. It pressed in on him, amplifying the sound of his own ragged breathing. The scent of Isabel's perfume, a faint floral note, lingered in the air, a ghost of her presence. Leo walked over to the hearth where the blue soup bowl, the one Anna used to use, the one Maya had suggested for Isabel, still sat. He stared at it, a symbol of the fragile connection he had allowed himself to feel. It was a fool's hope. With a guttural cry of pure rage and grief, he picked up the bowl and hurled it against the stone fireplace. It shattered into a dozen pieces, the sound a sharp, satisfying crack in the oppressive quiet. He sank to the floor, his head in his hands. He had let her in. He had opened the door to the locked room of his heart, and she had walked in with her money and her lawyers and her world of calculated compassion. He felt raw, exposed, and profoundly stupid. Daddy? He looked up. Maya was standing in the doorway to her room, her small face creased with worry. She looked at him, then at the broken pieces of the bowl on the floor. Her lip began to tremble. "Mommy's bowl," she whispered. The sight of her fear, the realization that his anger was now wounding her, cut through his rage like a knife. He had protected her from the world, but he couldn't protect her from himself. He was poisoning her with his own bitterness, passing his endless grief down to her like a cursed inheritance. Was this the man he wanted to be? The father he wanted her to have? A man who smashes the last remnants of his wife's memory in a fit of pride? He looked at the shattered ceramic. Broken. Like him. Like the trust he'd placed in Isabel. He could leave it there, a testament to his pain. He could sweep it up, throw it away, and lock the door to his heart for good. Or he could try to fix it. Slowly, painfully, he got down on his hands and knees. He began to pick up the pieces, one by one. The edges were sharp. "It's okay, sweet pea," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's broken. But I think we can fix it." He had to choose. He could cling to his righteous anger, a cold and lonely comfort. Or he could take a terrifying leap of faith and believe that the woman he'd met in the storm, the real, vulnerable, guilty Isabel, was still in there somewhere, fighting her way out. The helicopter ride was a blur. The sterile, white-walled hospital suite they brought her to felt more like a prison. Cutler and the legal team buzzed around her, a swarm of anxious efficiency. "We're drafting the press release," the lawyer, Harrison, scrolling through his phone. "Struggling single dad, a hero. You, the grateful survivor, will announce the establishment of a multi-million-dollar educational trust for the daughter. It's perfect. It buries the North Star liability issue under a mountain of goodwill." Cutler nodded. "We need to get ahead of this, Miss Vance. We need to control the narrative." Isabel sat on the edge of the hospital bed, the crisp sheets cool against her skin. She heard their words control the narrative, liability, goodwill, but they sounded like a foreign language. She was looking at them, at their expensive suits and their calculated expressions, and she saw them for the first time. They were the architects of the fortress she had built around her life. And she hated it. Her mind wasn't on press releases. It was in a rustic cabin, filled with the smell of wood smoke. It was on a man's face, ravaged by a betrayal she had inadvertently caused. She thought of his story about Anna's laugh, about the garden she planted in bad soil. She thought of his daughter's solemn, trusting eyes. "What about justice?" Isabel asked, her voice quiet. Harrison and Cutler exchanged a look. "Justice was served, legally speaking," Harrison said carefully. "The original suit was settled. From a corporate standpoint, our only duty now is to mitigate any new financial or PR exposure." "That wasn't justice," Isabel said, her voice gaining strength. "That was a payoff. We are going to reopen the investigation into the North Star collapse. We're going to release every internal document from Omnicorp about the deferred maintenance. We're going to issue a public, formal apology to every family affected. And we are going to establish a real victims' compensation fund, not as a PR stunt, but because it's the right thing to do." The two men stared at her, aghast. "Mrs. Vance, with all due respect, that would be corporate suicide," Cutler said. "The stock would plummet. The board would have your head." "My father would have done what you're suggesting," Isabel said, standing up. The pain in her arm was a dull throb, a reminder of what was real. "He would have buried it. He would have protected the company, no matter the human cost." She met their gaze, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly in command, not of a corporation, but of herself. "But I am not my father." Her choice was made. She could save her company's reputation, or she could save her soul. She could cling to the legacy of power and control she had inherited, or she could earn the respect of the one man who saw her not as a billionaire, but as a person. She picked up the phone on the bedside table. "Get me a helicopter," she commanded. "I'm going back." Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight with ourselves, in the quiet moments after the storm. It's in that silence we must choose between the armor that protects us and the vulnerability that can set us free. If you had to choose between protecting your pride and pursuing a difficult truth, which would you choose and why? Tell us your story in the comments. Leo sat at his scarred wooden table, his large, calloused hands painstakingly fitting together the broken pieces of the blue bowl. He worked with the focused precision of a surgeon, applying a thin line of wood glue to each fractured edge. Maya sat across from him, watching in silence, occasionally handing him a small shard as if she were his assistant. The work was slow, meditative. Each piece he joined, felt like an act of penance, a quiet promise to his daughter and to himself that he would not let bitterness be the thing that defined them. He would not let the past shatter his present. The cracks were still visible, a web of fine lines marring the blue glaze. It would never be perfect again, but it would be whole. He had just fitted the last piece into place when he heard it again. The distant whomp whomp of an approaching helicopter. His heart seized. He expected a lawyer to come knocking, a messenger with a check and a final insulting offer. He steeled himself, his jaw tightening. He wouldn't rage this time. He would simply close the door. He stood and went to the window, Maya peeking around his legs. The same black helicopter from before was landing in the clearing. But this time, only one person emerged. Isabel. She was wearing a simple pair of jeans and a thick parka, clothes someone had clearly procured for her. Her arm was in a proper sling now, but she moved with a determined purpose. She didn't have an entourage. She was alone. She walked 100 yards to the cabin, her steps steady in the snow. She stopped on the porch, hesitating for a moment before knocking softly on the door. Leo took a deep breath. He opened it. They stood for a long moment, the cold air swirling between them. He saw no trace of the powerful CEO or the frantic survivor. He saw a woman who looked tired but resolute. Her eyes, clear and direct, held no artifice. "Leo," she began, her voice steady, "I am not here to offer you money. I am not here with lawyers or non-disclosure agreements. I'm here to tell you what I've done." She didn't wait for an invitation to speak. She laid it all out, right there on the porch. She told him about reopening the North Star investigation. She told him about her order to release the internal documents, the ones that would prove his case beyond any doubt. She told him about the public apology she was preparing to make, not as Vance Industries, but as Isabel Vance, personally. She told him she was facing down her board, her legacy, and the entire corporate structure her father had built. "It might destroy my company," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I might lose everything. But it's the right thing to do. It's the only thing to do. Justice for Anna and for the other families. It's long overdue. I can't undo the past. I can't bring her back. But I can stop hiding from the truth." Leo listened, his defenses slowly, piece by piece, crumbling away. This wasn't a PR strategy. This was atonement. This was a woman dismantling her own world to honor the memory of a woman she'd never met. It was an act of courage so profound it left him speechless. The anger he had nursed for 5 long years, the cold, hard stone of it in his chest, finally, blessedly dissolved. In its place, something new and fragile began to grow. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why do all this?" Isabel's gaze softened. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "Because you showed me what's real," she said. "In this cabin, for 2 days, I felt more human than I have in my entire life. You and Maya, you have a life here, not just an existence. You have love. My father built an empire on the idea that sentiment was a weakness. But he was wrong. It's the only thing that has any real value. It's the only thing worth fighting for." She took a half step closer. "And because I can't stand the thought of you looking at me the way you did when I left." From behind Leo's leg, Maya stepped forward. In her small hands, she held a single, perfect pine cone. She held it out to Isabel. "This is for your arm," she said solemnly. to make it better. A tear, the one Isabel had refused to shed, finally escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She knelt, her good hand gently accepting the small gift. "Thank you, Maya," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's the most valuable thing I've ever been given." She looked up at Leo, her eyes asking a silent question. He stepped back, opening the door wider. It was an invitation, an acceptance, an answer. "Come inside," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "It's cold out." Isabel stood and walked into the warmth of the cabin. Her eyes fell on the table where the blue bowl sat, its cracks filled with golden lines of dried glue. A beautiful, imperfect, repaired thing. Whole again. She looked at Leo, and he looked at her. The chasm between their worlds of wealth and poverty, of power and grief, was still there. But it was no longer an impassable gulf. A bridge had been built, forged in fire, tested by betrayal, and now, finally, fortified by truth and a shared, unexpected hope. They didn't know what the future held. There were investigations and apologies, and corporate battles still to come. But here, in the quiet of the mountains, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the promise of a different future, they had found something rare. It wasn't a storybook ending, not yet. It was something more real. A beginning. Unexpected love, rising from the ashes. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly emotional journey. The paths our lives take are rarely straight, and sometimes the people who seem the most different from us are the ones who hold the key to our own healing. Do you believe true forgiveness requires justice, or can it exist on its own? We would love to read your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your stories and insights are what make this community so special. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart. We'll see you next time.